on the AI work.
see.
So I'm super excited about my talented team bringing their expertise to the table.
I was with Caroline yesterday for something else, and she mentioned about today, and I said, yes, I'm going to be there, and
So
I'll be at
glad.
several more. So I'm very glad to be able to participate because I'm still teaching.
I'm so glad that you're here too. And all the recordings are up on our CTRL website.
Mhm.
So that's really exciting too, that we can come back to it as we need them.
Thank
So
you.
yeah,
Give my best to everybody, please.
yeah, thanks. Well, I see we're at 12:30. Allison has started the recording, and I'm going to turn it over to David, who is going to be our presenter today. So thank you, David. I don't think I need to introduce him. I think everybody knows him.
All right. Thank you to everyone for coming to the meeting. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. So today what we're going to be talking about is the use of AI and academic integrity. We have talked about this a few times. I see some familiar faces from our previous talks about this. So if anyone who has previous experience with this type of topic, finding students using AI when they weren't supposed to, or finding a way to work AI into their lessons to create something valuable, there will be opportunities to share some of that information with everyone, because some of that could be valuable to people who haven't had those experiences yet. So basically the agenda today, we're going to look at strategies to identify content that was created with AI. This is not a perfect system because there isn't one, but we're going to look at some strategies that might help. We're going to look at some ways to redesign assessments so that it might be a little bit harder to use AI, or it might be easier to catch someone when they do. And we're also going to look at student accountability, communicating with students about what we expect with AI. There may be situations where we want them to use it or where it's helpful for them to use it. And there might be situations where it is not something we want them to do. Just like with a calculator, there might be times that it's helpful for students to have one, and there might be times where they're missing out on learning something they should know how to do by using that instead. All right, so some strategies. There are some words that do sometimes occur more often in AI than in human writing. AI tends to write in a very formulaic way. It has specific rules about how it writes things, and so it tends to repeat those actions over and over again. So if it believes that the best word is the, or it, or is, it's just going to use that every time. Humans are much less consistent. Even if we're trying to be consistent, we just tend to phrase things a bit more conversationally. And so writing from AI can sometimes look mechanical. It can sometimes look like every sentence is very similar because it is mechanical. It's just following rules that it was taught to follow. AI has the ability to hallucinate. It will make stuff up. So if you ask it for sources and it doesn't see a source that it really likes, it will invent a source and it will put it into very realistic, formatting and make it look really good. But if you look for that source, it simply doesn't exist. So if students are turning in work and they're using sources that just physically don't exist, that's a pretty good sign that they didn't find those from real research because it doesn't exist. It can also make up things in a source that don't exist. So maybe the textbook is real. It put in the name of the textbook the student asked it to, but it doesn't know that book. So it just invented some stuff that was in there that seemed plausible to it. And if you know that book, you can probably look at what it came up with and say, well, that's not what chapter 5 says. That's just not in there. So there are some flaws that it can make. The problem comes in when we try to when we try to find a really fast way to identify AI writing. A lot of people want to use a detector. They want to use some type of software to really pick out, oh, this student cheated. This student didn't do what I told them to. And there just isn't a reliable way to do that. Reviewers have found that untrained human detection is comparable to random chance. So us looking at something, guessing whether it's AI, is pretty much like just throwing stuff at the wall. We're about 50-50 in whether we're right or wrong. And it's almost as bad for automated tools. Automated tools are accurate in about 80% of cases. In other words, that automated tool might give you a heads up that you should look more closely at a specific response, but it's not going to tell you that it was written with AI. There have been cases where people ran the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence or other historical documents through AI detectors and were told, yes, this is 100% AI. Obviously, it's not, but it's fine. What it's identifying is that the writing is very stilted. It's very formal. It's an older style of writing we don't use a lot anymore. And it's flagging that as something that's probably AI, even though it's not. This is also going to catch students who are not native speakers of English, because it's going to look for some of the non-standard wording that they're likely to use. A lot of the mistakes that non-native speakers of English use are assuming that English follows specific rules it doesn't follow. And computers also tend to assume that, so that's going to get picked up a lot. So we can't reliably pick out that something is AI just by reading it. And we also can't count 100% on software to pick out that something is AI. What actually works, the thing that we can do is we can try to use a variety of things together. We can communicate to students up front what our policies are so that if they choose to violate those, they're consciously doing that. They know that it's something we asked them not to do, or we told them they can do it in this way, but not in another way. For example, we may have told them that something like Grammarly, that is a AI-based grammar detector, is acceptable, but that using AI to fully write their essay is not. Or there may be some other combination of things that we've told them are or are not acceptable in our class. A few other things we can look for to give us a heads up that we might want to look more carefully at something. Overly complex or just odd sentence construction or word choices. Repeatedly using the same words in a way that just doesn't sound natural. Lack of emotion, as if it's just written by a computer. Any essay prompt or discussion prompt that asks people for their personal experiences, that is hard for AI because it has no personal experiences. It will make some up, but it will have trouble getting the details accurate or in a realistic way because it has never done the things that it's making up. It's just assuming that they'd probably go a certain way. So, for example, if you are familiar with the location or you're familiar with the type of activity that person was doing, you'll probably find flaws in what the AI does. Anything requiring current events, AI tends to be a few years out of date, especially if it's the free version, which is probably what most students are using. So if it's something that happened last week, you could easily find out about it and write about it, but AI isn't going to know what happened, and it will just make something up that won't be what happened. And like we said, do the sources exist? Do the journals exist? And this last one's really the biggest thing. Does the writing make sense for that student? Is this a student who in class can barely, turn in something coherent, and now they have this essay that looks very polished? And then that's odd that they can suddenly do that. Or you talk to them about, the knowledge that went behind what they wrote, and they don't know anything about it. Like they can't verbally discuss it. Well, that's interesting because if they just wrote 3 pages about it, they really should have some knowledge about what they just wrote. And if they can't answer questions about their research, that's a sign that they didn't do, the research. And so some of this stuff can just get put together to start making a case that you should look into something if you feel that something violated your policies. But we can also prevent problems from occurring by using better instructional design in our courses. Sometimes we'll have prompts for discussions, for essays that have one specific right answer. This means that even without AI, every student is going to turn in the same response. So for example, if the discussion is on page 122, discuss the theory of blank. Almost everyone is going to read page 122. They're going to turn in a response about what the author said on page 122. And even without any cheating, everyone's going to have basically the same response because there's one answer to the question. The author said, what they said on page 122. A more complicated question is harder both to copy out of the textbook and to find some computer to write for you. So something where you're taking the information from page 122 and also comparing it to some other sources that might have a different point of view, maybe sources that the student is picking out, maybe incorporating personal experiences with that topic or how it's impacted them. It's a better question. It's a question that requires them to think at a higher level than that first question does. But also, it's harder for a computer to do because it's going to require a lot more synthesis of different ideas. It requires the computer to know what these sources are. It's going to be a much more difficult response to do if you haven't done the reading, if you haven't done the work. So in general, things that are quality instruction without AI also can prevent some of these issues from ever occurring. And you could also have situations where if an essay prompt was written in a way where they have to have personal experience and they have to have recent sources, where students even could be encouraged to use AI and would still have to write their own essay because, they would have to go through and make significant changes to what it comes up with to actually meet the requirements. Are there any questions before we go any further? Clara?
Hi, this is not so much a question, but a comment. I'll just say that I have had students use AI even on like discussion posts where they're supposed to talk about their own personal experience. So just something to consider when you design your assignments, because I think it is still possible. So there's still a way for students to use AI.
There's absolutely still a way, but I'd also point out that you caught those students. So it still worked because it made it more obvious that they had done that and made it possible for you to both figure out that they had done that and then make a case that they solidly did, they did what you said that they did. So even though it may not prevent 100% of cases, the fact that it made it possible for you to detect that and to demonstrate that that's what happened, I think that does still send a message because there's it's the same as when you're on the highway and there's a certain spot where there's always a police car. And you can see that even when there's not, people are slowing down before that exit because they're expecting that there's a 50-50 chance they'll get pulled over there. And I think the more that students have the mindset that this instructor reads what I turn in, they know how to look for these things, they're likely to catch me, it reduces the likelihood that a student's going to do that because it's not that big of a place. Like these students know each other, they talk to each other. And if someone has an experience where an instructor, called that out, that's going to get around. People know that that person knows how to detect this type of stuff. They know how to implement it properly in their classes. And I think that's a discouraging factor for people who might be looking for a shortcut. Are there any other questions or thoughts or prior experiences?
I'd love to know, both Nicole and Clara have both talked about it. I'm wondering, what were the things that tipped you off that they used AI?
This is Clara. I'll go. So I'll say that I actually didn't know for sure with those discussion posts. So it turns out that student had been using AI the entire semester. And this was also an online course, so I didn't have an like in-person writing samples. Um, but there were some other odd behaviors and other patterns of behaviors that I knew. So my spidey senses were up. It wasn't until the very last paper that the students submitted. They put in something that didn't make sense. So they put in names of people as though they were the authors of a book, and they were not. So then I kind of looked at everything that the student had submitted the entire semester, and that's when I found out. And there were other ways that I was able to figure out for certain that the student used AI. Um, so this was kind of fun. I had noticed that in the students' discussion post responses to other students, they had used AI. And the reason I figured out was because they were making references to things that the student they were responding to didn't say, if that makes sense. So, like, student A wrote something, the cheating student made a response. Student B wrote something else, the cheating student made a response, responding to something that student A said. And what happened was, what I figured out was that the student who used AI just put everything in the same thread in ChatGPT. And so ChatGPT thinks it's one conversation. And so ChatGPT made a reference to what student A said, and the student just copied and pasted it into the comment. And I actually was able to replicate, because like I just plugged everything into ChatGPT, and I was able to show that the student just copied and pasted what ChatGPT said. But yeah, otherwise, I mean, I agree. It's very hard to catch, even when the students were supposed to be talking about their own personal experiences. Sometimes it's like you have to wait for them to slip up, so to speak. Um, so I still think like a lot of times they are still able to um, go undetected, or at least not clear enough. Like it wasn't like I was able to know right away that the student was using ChatGPT. It took a while of like lots of suspicion to get there. But that was my situation.
Great. Wow. I love it. I put in the chat, we need a workshop on cultivating our teacher's spidey sense.
And I think Clara made a good point that you're not going to catch everyone. You also probably didn't successfully catch everyone with prior methods that students used to get around things they were told to do before ChatGPT, whether it was plagiarizing something or having stuff written on the side of a pencil and then taking it into a test, or whatever else students have done over the years to try to get away with something. These tactics have existed before computers even existed, and some percentage of those students have probably gotten away with it forever. So we're not going to catch everything, but the hope is that by clearly communicating what we do want them to do, and then keeping an eye out for things like what Clara said, where they just put stuff in that just doesn't make sense. The student could have avoided that by having better prompt construction, like Caroline talked about in our last workshop. But most people who are looking to take a shortcut are not going to workshops about prompt construction. and may not be putting in the very best prompts into AI when they get these responses. This is not an AI concept, but something I think is important to think about is the concept of backwards design. Basically, what it is the idea that we should plan the whole course by starting with our goals, the outcomes we want students to achieve. And then we should figure out the assessments and instruction that work towards those goals. And the reason this is important is because there might be cases where we want people to use AI, where the AI would be a successful way of accomplishing the goal that we wanted them to set out to do. And there also might be cases where it's not acceptable to do that, and we want to clearly communicate that we don't want them to do this. It's also important because there may be times that somebody did do something we didn't want them to do and has still achieved the goals that we set out for them to do. We didn't want them to use this tool, but when we look further, we find out that they do have the ability to complete multiple types of assessment on that topic, and they do genuinely seem to have met that objective. And at that point, we can decide based on our policies whether that is important or whether that's something that maybe isn't a problem for people to do on that particular assignment. I have some examples here of some questions that I wrote. So I have example 1 here, and I have a very simple question, one that would be fairly easy for someone to plug in to any sort of AI tool. And then I have a second one here where I've made it much more difficult because I've asked them to use multiple sources. I've asked them to write a longer essay. Longer essays are harder for people to write without detection because they're more likely to have had a mistake in ChatGPT or whatever. And I've asked them to use personal examples as well. So sometimes things that would be better questions to begin with can make it harder. It doesn't necessarily stop them from doing it, but it makes it easier to notice that they weren't successful at doing it. I also took my original question and I put it into ChatGPT, and I used ChatGPT as a tool to rewrite my question. So in this first part here, I've used the prompt that you see on that second bullet point, and I asked it to rewrite that first question I wrote, the very short one, and I told it the parameters that I wanted it to add to the question. And ChatGPT did rewrite it for me and gave me the question that you see on the last bullet point. So it can be useful to us as well as instructors. In this case, since it was such a short prompt, my instructions to ChatGPT are probably about as lengthy as what it wrote for me. But there could certainly be other cases where it might be a useful tool that would save you some time in improving questions that you have in your course that you'd like to make more detailed or more specific in some way. And to do that, all you would need to do is just give it instructions like I did, where you tell it to rewrite the question, and then tell it what you want it to do to the question. And it can do this with any number of different tasks. It's very good at repetitive work. So if you have a whole list of questions and you want them all rewritten the same way, it's very good at repetitively doing exactly the same thing, or making lists or making tables or other things that a computer would generally be good at. It's very good at repeating things. All right, before we go on to this next part, which will be about Brightspace, I wanted to see if there's any questions or comments at this point. All right, let me get into Brightspace and then I will bring that up and we can take a look. Oh, go ahead.
David, I'm sorry. I wasn't sure if this was the right time. I had a student last semester and basically, because of back and forth conversation, I believed him. This wasn't an act, but he basically said that the word Word that he has is packaged with Grammarly. And so when he wrote me a response that I knew was real because I knew he had had that experience, it basically came up as varying degrees of AI written because Grammarly would suggest words and he'd incorporate them. So I'm curious if at some point you could maybe address what are ways we can work with students with something like that, whereas they may not even realize it's doing that, but it's an opportunity to talk about word choice, et cetera. And I think he also used like the thesaurus.com as a source. So anyway.
Right. I think that's the key to having clear policies for the students about upfront what we do and do not consider acceptable.
Right.
Most tools in Word can be turned off if there's a big reason we don't want students to use them. But it's true, Microsoft Office is increasingly incorporating more and more resources. I don't think Grammarly is specifically part of Word, but you could certainly have a browser plugin on your Chrome browser, which many people do. And then if you were writing on the web version of Word, it would continue to flag those items. But there are tools increasingly being built into Microsoft Office too. Especially if we have a student who's using, say, a workplace computer, and that workplace has purchased, the upgrades to Copilot. They might have very detailed AI tools that could actually construct, an entire PowerPoint or other things for them. So to some extent, I think that some of this stuff is going to be increasingly built in. I also think there's a big difference between grammar checks and spell checks and word suggestions, which have been part of word processors for a long time.
Right.
And fully constructing something from an AI source, which to me is the bigger issue than using tools built into a word processor for guidance. I don't think there's a lot of people not using the built-in spell checkers or grammar checkers in their word processors. And there's probably a very high percentage of students with Grammarly installed because the plugin is free at the basic level. And although its suggestions are not always right, it does tend to flag things that are worth looking at. And that can be helpful for students too, because the ability to differentiate between correct and incorrect suggestions. Grammarly is not always right. If you took every one of its suggestions at face value, you're going to have a lot of grammatical mistakes in your paper, because it doesn't always correctly understand what you're doing.
Right.
And so there is some ability in there on the student's part to say, no, it's wrong about this, I'm going to ignore this one. Or it's right that that's wrong, but that's not the right way to fix it. I'm going to fix it like this.
Right. Or even choosing certain words, it's going to change the tone of their writing, and they may not be thinking about that as well.
Right. And so I think that if they're using it correctly, they're still thinking a lot about the grammar of what they're writing. Now, if they're just blindly putting in whatever it says,
right,
even if you don't catch that, you're probably going to find mistakes and mark down their paper.
Sure.
Because I haven't seen a time where it could correctly find and correct every error, in a large document. It's going to make mistakes. The stuff built into Word does too. Like it's convinced that you mean one specific word and you don't. And if you just take all of its suggestions, the wrong word's going to appear, 10 places in your paper. It sees the word Carlow and it thinks you mean, I don't know, cookie or whatever. Mm-hmm. And it just goes through and changes it all. And now your paper doesn't make sense. So I think that's a big difference in a student using it as a tool, but then still having to use critical thinking to figure out if the tool is right. And
Sure.
The student just saying, okay, it says this, it must know. And then, making just tons of mistakes.
Sure. Thanks, David.
Does anyone else have questions or experiences with this? All right, so I'm going to share a Brightspace screen here. And we're going to take a look because we have some options in Brightspace that can be helpful as well. One of these options is the class progress tool. We have the ability to get some very granular data in Brightspace on what our students are doing, what they're looking at, the amount of time they're spending on things. And this is data that can be helpful, not just with AI, but really with any sort of communication with students about why they're not being super successful in a class. So let's take a quick look at this one here. It's all on the purple bar at the top of the page. Now this one is a sandbox, so it will have less data than your real classes do. But you can see I do have a student in this class. And the student hasn't done a lot of work because he doesn't exist. But we'll see that there's some data here on the work he has done. All right, so there's a list of different categories of what it tracks. And on each one, I have an arrow where I can open up additional information about what the student has done. And so this is an interesting thing to look for right here. This student has viewed 0 content objects in the class. So they have not viewed any of the content or done any of the things they were asked to do, but did take the quiz. So this is interesting information because it could tell me 2 things. It could tell me that they are getting the information for this quiz from someplace other than the class. Maybe they Googled it, or it could tell me that the quiz is not tied to my objectives. If my content and my quiz or my paper or whatever are not aligned, like the backwards design we were talking about, they might be able to successfully do my assessments and not complete any of my work because they're not matched up. You don't need the information from the class content to pass the quiz. And that's why that alignment there is very important. Now, in a real course with a real student, there would be a lot more detail here. But in each one, we can simply open up with these arrows, and we can see exactly what the student has or hasn't done and what is in progress. And it is not a clear proof that they did or didn't do anything, but it can be very helpful information because a student who's consistently not reading the PowerPoint that you shared with them or not watching the video that you put into the week telling them how to do the paper, it's interesting if they didn't watch the instructional video and then also didn't do well when they did the work. And that's something that might be helpful for them to know, is that they didn't do, what they were asked to do and then suddenly didn't do well. They don't always see that connection. You have the same capability if you are an advisor to anyone. So if you are an advisor to any students, on your homepage right here, under your courses, there is a link called Audit Users, and you will find that you have the same capability for anyone you are listed to be an auditor of. This is something I update manually, so if it is not perfect, if you don't see someone you need, you can reach out to me and I can correct that for you. But you'll see a list of users here and you can click them and you can see exactly the same tool that you saw in your course for any course that this student is enrolled in. And this can be helpful information with advisees and helping them understand why they didn't do well on something, or why an instructor thinks they used AI because they haven't done the work to lead up to the assignment. Are there any questions about the class progress or the audit users tool? Okay. Oh,
David,
yes, I
real
do see a
quick,
question. Yes.
it's still not possible to run a report for the whole class, right? We still have to either, I think what we've been able to do was I created intelligent agents that will run me a whole class report. But other than that, there's not a way to do this on a whole class. Is that still correct?
Right. At the instructor level, the intelligent agent's the best way to get a report.
Got it. Thank you.
And speaking of tools in Brightspace, if you do have an interest in the intelligent agents, that is where you can find them right here. They're under More Options and Intelligent Agents. And another thing we're going to look at here in Brightspace is there are several instructional tools that can both help to make the content more interactive than, say, uploading a PowerPoint, and also allow you to use AI as the instructor to get some help with some of the work that you might need to complete to design the course. So I'm going to come to my content page and click Upload Create. And then from here, I'm going to create a file. I do need to give it a title. And then there is a plus sign button right here. This is for Creator Plus. And there are several different things that we have access to through Creator Plus. That is interesting. That is not bringing up what I wanted it to. Okay, let's try that again. See if it will work the way I wanted it to for the demonstration. Okay, that is not working, so I think we might not look at that. Well, anyway, this button is supposed to have Creator Plus, and this is where it is supposed to be located. And I will look into later today why it is not there.
I've noticed that a couple of times too, David, so it's not you.
Yeah,
Let's try reloading the page and see if it'll come back.
David, you also may want to get in as the administrator because those usually don't have that issue.
Okay, let me see. Maybe I have the wrong account in here. I'll add that one as well. Right, let's see if that'll let me have the tool. No. Okay, well, there is a tool called Creator Plus, and if you look at it on your course, you will hopefully find it under this plus sign. You can find it in a number of different tools within Brightspace. Here I'm in the Create a File tool, and it would be right here under that plus sign.
See if you go to create an assignment if it's different.
Yeah, let's take a look here. Okay, and no, it
it's
is not giving me the right thing.
Okay.
So that is interesting. But in an assignment, it should be right here under the plus sign. If it were cooperating with our presentation, and this is where you would find it. It may be that if you're logged into Brightspace, you may find it there, even though I don't. And you should also be able to find it right there under a couple of other tools. Like right here, we are in the discussion tool, and it should again be under this plus sign. Let me see if I view this class as a different person, if that would help.
David, I looked at my own, even as administrator, and it seems to be missing. I think we might need to bring this up with Brightspace and find out why it's suddenly missing for everyone.
Yep, you were right. I'm looking at it as a different account and I still don't see it. So that is very interesting. We will find out why that is broken and fix that for you. And then once it's working again, you would find it right here under this plus sign. There would be a tool for creating questions, and that one will include something called Lumi, which would give you an AI tool to create questions for yourself. It will create multiple types of test questions. It will give you a number of tools to make interactive content, like pop-ups and flashcards and tabs that can be opened or closed. And so it has a number of different tools available to you. And the AI is within the question tool. So it can, for example, read a block of text that you give it and create a multiple choice question, true, false, and various other types of questions based on your content. But it looks like that is not going to work like I was hoping it would. So we will look into why that is broken. All right. I know you probably don't have a lot of questions about Creator Plus since it is not operating, but has anyone had experience with it or questions about it that they would like to ask while we're on that topic? Or questions or comments about anything else that we've talked about that you'd like to get more information about? Beth.
So I just maybe have a discussion for everyone. What, listening to all this, I'm concerned about the amount of time it is going to take instructors actually to do a thorough examination of things, unless it's becoming red flags. Clara's example was, one that I was like, wow, that took a lot of time for her to. And that was after she'd seen so much. I just wondered how everyone is handling this in terms of the amount of time they can spend to even try to identify this. I'm just worried about all of you. That's really.
I mean, I can speak from my experience, and that's, teaching writing in graduate school to graduate students. I'm teaching a bunch of nurses who have a lot of time, their time is limited. And I'm actually teaching them how to use it to help them with the writing, because that's not their strong suit. And I think that it really comes down to something that David was talking about earlier, and it is building that into the design of your class. And so the more opportunities you have to get feedback, and it's interesting that the students that I'm teaching, I'm like, okay, try using it for writing, and then try and see, what does it come up with that you didn't come up with. And most of the students are saying they like their writing better than ChatGPT, which, and I did that with undergraduates too, and they were saying the same thing. And I think it just comes down to, are we building those checks and balances into our class and into the instructional design? And I think those are the ways that we're going to be able to maybe protect our time a little bit around it, because you're right, it is taking a lot of time for evaluation. I don't know that that was really helpful, but it was just my experience.
I do think it's a significant amount of time that it creates in detecting its use. But if it's used properly, there can also be a significant amount of time savings in getting it to do some of your work as an instructor. I know we weren't able to look at Lumi since it's decided not to be part of our presentation today. But here we have ChatGPT, which is open. And what I have here, I have the text from the PowerPoint from our first slide. And I am going to ask it to write a number of questions based upon this. And so obviously these may or may not be questions I want to use. I might have to coach it to get exactly the information that I wanted. But in a few seconds there, it wrote a quiz for me about some of the content that we talked about today. That doesn't mean I necessarily want to use this as it is. I might want to edit some of this or tell it that this is wrong and that I wanted it to do something different. but I think there's the capacity to both save a lot of time and make up for some of that extra time and helping the students to learn to use it responsibly. Are there any other questions or thoughts?
This is Caroline. I just saw that Clara is interested in using learning to use AI, to incorporating it into assessments and perhaps other activities. So I've done that with a number of instructors, and I'd be very happy to work one-on-one with people, or perhaps give a presentation that can give you some guidelines.
Thank you.
Are there any other comments or any other thoughts that people wanted to share?
Only one more for Clara, and that is, come on Friday, I'm going to be talking about how I've used ChatGPT to help me create rubrics, and the good, the bad, and the ugly of the rubrics that Chat has created, as well as training Chat to help me give feedback to students about their writing, so that I'm not saying things like, no, this is terrible. And I'm able to kind of tone it down a little bit and give them some thoughtful, consistent feedback.
Great. And one of the great things about those Friday sessions is those are more interactive than the Wednesday sessions.
Yeah, I have all
So
kind of
if you-
hands-on for y'all.
So if you want to try some of the things that we've talked about in various sessions, those Friday sessions are a great time to bring a course and experiment with some of the things we've talked about. Are there any other questions or comments?
I was going to say something, if you don't mind. I was just first, I was just going to, thank Caroline for offering to help with the kind of AI kind of stuff. I think I'm just speaking for myself, but I'm probably not alone with some folks, and just being behind on really understanding ChatGPT and how to use it properly, so that I could actually do things like Alexis is doing, so that I can guide them in the proper ways to use it, and the ways not to use it, and the pitfalls of it. So that's, I think, a catching up kind of thing. And also related to that, though, I think is like you were discussing about designing those assignments and rubrics in ways that doesn't benefit you to use ChatGPT, because you have to incorporate certain things that can't be done. That I could improve upon, but I think that is the best probably thing that we should be doing right now, just because my personal opinion is I don't want to be a police officer or anything like this. I think it can create I think, it's easy to fall in the trap of creating this mindset of everybody's looking for the easy way out. Everyone is trying to cheat. And then what am I doing? That's not what I signed up to do. I'm really here to teach and encourage the students, and I don't want to be spending my time suspecting students of something uh, that I find unethical. So anyway, my responsibility, though, I think, is I have to guide them and learn these things so that I can teach them on how to do this right. Because my assumption is all the students really are here because they want to be successful and get their degrees. However, we all know under the stress and pressure of certain things, we might defer to something the so-called easy way out because we're under that pressure. I have to try to help them so that they don't fall into that trap and to relieve some of that pressure. Anyway, that's my little rant. Take it or leave it for for what you want. But I appreciate the support from all of you folks and the ideas.
I think those are some really good points. And Alexis pointed out that you're not behind. This is a very new thing. Part of the problem is that it's new for students and for us. So all of us are sort of learning how to use it to help us, and how maybe it's not very useful. And so I think that it's a quickly developing thing. Cindy has her hand up.
I hope you can understand me. I unfortunately have laryngitis. But what I wanted to say is I am particularly struggling myself with how not to remove the struggle in education. In other words, I teach business communications. It would be very easy to integrate ChatGPT into my class. However, my students need to struggle with thinking about what's appropriate to put in any type of professional communication that they send out. So I'm hesitant in what the best way is to try to incorporate something before they've struggled with how to do it. Because if they use it first and that struggle is removed, then when they go to compare whether what was spit out by AI is appropriate or not, I'm not sure they can make that determination. Am I making sense?
No,
Yeah.
I think I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to answer that because, as a librarian, we've been trying to teach information literacy skills forever. But when Google came along in, the late 1900s, early 2000s, it was, we wanted the students to be critical thinkers and not just take anything that came off of Google as gospel truth, right? So we wanted them to use the library resources. Well, fast forward to 2025, and guess what they're using? They're not really using the library resources as much. I think it's on us in many ways to think about this from the perspective of critical thinking, right? The learning objectives are not changing. The tools are changing, but the learning objectives are not changing. And so if your goal is to get them to think critically, how do you use the technology to get them to that point? So for example, like I was saying, I had the students do a compare and contrast. I had them work with ChatGPT and do their own thing and then do the compare and contrast. It wasn't a big long thing. It was one paragraph. Write one paragraph on this topic of interest from the field of nursing, and then ask ChatGPT to write you the same thing, and then compare notes and see which one you like better or which one is more evaluative of the topic or whatever it is. But I think that it's teaching them to critically use the tools. They're not going to not use them. They're going to use them. So I think it's on us to say, okay, and you go back, I mean, when we were kids, I mean, think about it. We're old enough to remember when calculators were new. And God help us, we are, in that age group. And I remember the conversation being, they'll never learn math. They'll never learn math. Well, we learned math. We just learned how to critically think through the process. And maybe some of our teachers made us do the work longhand and then use the computer or the calculator to check it. Right. So, I mean, I think it's up to us to find the creative ways of teaching them. And the bottom line is not to use the question isn't, do we use these tools or don't we? The question is, how do we teach the critical thinking skills to use them effectively? Because they are not going away, just like Google Scholar and Google did not go away.
I think that not going away is an important point, because when we think about how students are going to do these tasks in the workplace, it may very well be that these are the very tools they'll be using. And there may be a point where that's even an accepted practice in many organizations, but they need to learn to use it responsibly. They can't send out a marketing message that has a whole bunch of mistakes in it, or that misspells the name of the company, or that doesn't make any sense. Like, they need to know when they can use these tools responsibly and when they can't. And so I think that's where that backwards design really comes in, and figuring out what is really the key here. Like, what do we want them to come away with? Because if the goal is to know how to write business communication, then they may need to use AI, but they need to know how to use it the right way and not just slap something together that is going to create a problem for that company when they send out this mass email that doesn't make any sense, or that list a product that doesn't exist. And so I think that it's a productivity tool that I think business is going to use more and more, but I think it needs to be used responsibly. And I think students need to realize that it's not a replacement for doing the work. It's just a tool, just like when I remember when you had to do job applications on a typewriter, and it was a lot more work than doing them online now. But it's no longer a useful skill for me to know how to type my job application on a typewriter, because there are no longer employers handing me, sheets of paper and saying, type it up on this. So that the tools that we're using to do that work have changed. Today there are tools where in a lot of companies you apply and you upload your resume and it populates, half of the fields for you. So there are tools that are helpful, but people still need to know how to use them, because if it messes up those fields when it's auto-populating, then it's going to be flagged pretty quickly by that HR department that you didn't read your application before you put it in. Just like years ago, when I was younger, it would have been flagged pretty quickly if I messed up a whole bunch of typing stuff on the form and didn't take the time to redo it. So I still think they're going to have to put the effort in, but they need to put in different effort with different tools. We're getting pretty close to the end of our time. Does anyone else have a question or a comment or anything that we didn't get to? All right, well, thank you to everyone who came out. And if you do think of questions later or something you'd like to meet with us about and get some assistance, then please just email us and let us know what we can help you with. Have a great day.
Thanks, David. Thank you, everybody.